This is part 17 of AngularJS tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss how to consume an ASP .NET Web Service in an AngularJS application. Here is what we want to do. We're going to have this database table TBL employees. We want to retrieve data from this database table and display it on a web page. To retrieve data from the database table, we're going to make use of an ASP .NET Web Service. And then we're going to call that web service from Angular code and retrieve the data, display it on a web page. So the first step here is to create this database table, which I have already done. At the moment within this table we've got 5 rows. And here is the SQL script to create and populate this table with test data. I'll have the script available on my blog in case you need it. Now let's flip to Visual Studio. Here I have an ASP .NET Web Application project. Within the web.config file, we have a connection string that points to the SampleDB database on our local server, which has got our TBL employees table. Now the next step is to add a web service to this project, which is going to retrieve data from the employees table. So let's right click on this project, add a new item, and we want to add a web service. And I'm going to name this web service employee service. So we are going to write some ADO.NET code here, so I'm going to bring in some ADO.NET namespaces. We need system.configuration, we need system.data.SQL client, and we also need system.web.script.serialization namespace. We'll be using this namespace for converting the data to JSON format. And we want this web service to be called from JavaScript, so I'm going to uncomment this attribute system.web.script.services.script service. Now let's rename our function. We want our function to retrieve all the employees, so I'm going to call it getAllEmployees. This function is not actually going to return anything. Instead, it's actually going to write the employee data in a JSON format, so the return type here is going to be void. And within the function we are going to write some ADO.NET code. The first thing that we want to do is create a list of employee objects, basically the list of employee objects that we want to return. Now at the moment we don't have the employee class, so let's go ahead and create that class first. So I'm going to add a class file, and let's name this file employee.cs. And this class is going to have 4 properties. All of them are going to be public and auto-implemented properties. So the first one is going to be of type integer. ID is the name of the property. And the second one is going to be of type string, and the name of the property is going to be name. And the third property is going to be gender, and again of type string. And finally we are going to have an integer property, and this property name is going to be salary. So we have our employee class ready. So within our web method we want to create a list of employee object. Let's call it list employees equals new list of employee. Now we want to read the connection string from web.config file. So to hold that connection string, I'm going to create a variable. So configuration manager class dot connection strings of, and the name of our connection string is DBCS, and then let's use the connection string property. So we have our connection string property. Now next we are going to use SQL connection class and create a SQL connection object, and let's pass the connection string to this constructor to create a SQL connection object. The next step is to create a SQL command object. Let's call it cmd, and our SQL command is going to be select star from our table TBL employees, and we want the SQL command object to use this connection object. And the next thing to do is to open that connection, and we want to execute our command. So cm.execute reader. This is going to return a SQL data reader object. So let's go ahead and create a SQL data reader object. Now let's use a while loop and loop through each employee record that we get from the database. As we are looping through each employee record, what we want to do is create an employee object. Let's call it employee equals new employee. and we want to populate the properties of this employee object. So the first property that we want to populate is ID, which is an integer type, and the column name in the DB is ID, and we want to convert that to integer. So let's use the convert class dot toInt32, and we want to do same thing for name and gender. So the property here is going to be name, and the column name is name, and name is actually of type string, so I'm going to use .toString function and remove this convert dot toInt32. Let's do the same thing for gender. So gender column name is gender, and we want to convert that to a string, and the property name on the employee object is gender. And finally we have salary, which is integer, and the column name is salary. Alright, so we have our employee object with all its properties populated. Now we want to add this employee object to this list that we want to return. So list employees dot add, what we want to add is our employee object that we have constructed. So by the time this loop finishes, we have the list of employees added to this list right here. So what we want to do is convert those list of employees to a JSON format and write it to the current response stream. So to write it to the current response stream, I'm going to use the context class. So context.response.write. So I'm going to create an instance of JavaScript Serializer class, which is present in this namespace, system.web.script.serialization namespace. So let's create an instance of JavaScript Serializer class. Let's call it JS. And this JavaScript Serializer class has got serialize method, which is going to convert our list of employees to JSON format. So js.serialize, and to this we are going to pass our list employees. Alright, so we have a web service ready. Let's quickly test this web service to make sure it's returning us the employee data in JSON format. So we have our get all employees web method available. Let's invoke that, and we should be getting all the employee data in a JSON format. So we have our web service ready. Now we want to call this web service from Angular code. So I have this HTML page 1.html. So here we have our div element, which is having this ng controller attribute, and that's pointing to my controller, and this my controller is present in our script.js file. In the previous videos, in this video series, we have been hard coding the data within this controller function, but now this controller is going to call the web service, retrieve the data, and then present that to this web page. Okay, so to retrieve the data, we are going to use a service in Angular, and that is $HTTP service. We'll discuss in detail about this $HTTP service in our next video. For now, understand that we can use this service to communicate with a remote server. In our example, we are going to use this HTTP service to call the web service and retrieve the data. So how do I get that HTTP service? We just inject it to this function right here, just like how we have injected the $scope object. So I'm going to inject $HTTP service. Okay, and I'm going to use that object $HTTP, and this has got the get function. So I'm going to use that function and call the web service. So what is the URL for our web service? First of all, the name of our web service is employee service.asmx. So I'm going to copy that, and within that service we have a function, and the name of the function is get all employees. That's the web method that we want to call. So get all employees. So we're using this get method to call that web service. Now this request will be executed asynchronously. That means the data may not be immediately available. When the request completes, there is another function that's called then. So this function will be called. Okay, and here we can specify another JavaScript function which is going to handle the response that is returned from that successful call. So I'm going to have another function here, and this is the function that will be called when the request completes successfully, and this is going to get the response from the call, and the response is going to have a data property which contains the data from the web service, and we want to use that and initialize a property on our $scope object, which is going to be the model. So I'm going to use this $scope object, and this is going to have employees property equals, we have the response object, and this is going to have data property which will contain our employee data, and we are storing that in this employees, and employees is our model. So now all we have to do is within the view, that is within our HTML page 1.html, we can use an HTML table and present the data. So I'm going to use an HTML table here, and this table is going to have a t-head section. Within that, let's include a tr, and then we are going to include 3 th elements, actually 4. So the first one is going to display ID, name, gender, and finally salary. And then let's include a t-body section within our table, and within the t-body we are going to use tr, and on this tr element I'm going to use ngRepeat, and we are going to use this expression here for each employee in employees. So employees is our model, that's what we have attached to the scope object. So within the tr we are going to include 4 tds, and we are going to use the data binding expression. We are going to use this variable employee, and this should have id property, employee.id. Similarly, let's retrieve name, gender, and salary properties and display it. So name, gender, and finally salary. Alright, so let's save all our changes, and when we view this page in the browser we should get the data from the database table. For some reason, look at that, it doesn't display the data. Let's see why is that. So here, if you look at our script, we are using HTTP $HTTP service, we are using the get function of that object, and we are calling the web service. Now this function will be asynchronously executed, so the data will not be immediately available. When the request completes successfully, this then function is called, and we have a function here which is handling the response that is coming from the server, and we are populating the employees property on the scope object. And then within our HTML page we have our controller here, and then we are looping through each employee in our employees. That's the model, so we can see that here that's the property that we have attached to the scope object, and we are using our data binding expressions to retrieve ID, name, gender, and salary properties. So for some reason it's not displaying the data, so let's launch developer tools and inspect what's going on. So the developer tools, so it basically says the server responded with a status of 500. We're getting an internal server error. That's basically because here we're using a get request. Let's use a post request and see what's going to happen. So when I change that to post, it works. Look at that, it retrieves the data and displays it as expected. Now to make it work for get request, there's one little change that we have to do. So when we use get, look at this, when I reload this page we get the same error, 500 internal server error. So to make this work with the get request, we have to add one configuration section within our web.config file. So I'm going to include here a section under system.web for web services, and under web services I'm going to use protocols, and under protocols we are going to add HttpGet. So let's save these changes, and now when we reload this page, look at that, it works as expected. So here we have our controller function, and here is the code within the view. Thank you for listening and have a great day.